Welcome to another episode of Funding the Future, the stories behind the missions. Today I'm joined by Madlen Toumbourou from Madlen Toumbourou Consulting. Madlen's a highly skilled management consultant working with not-for-profits and for-purpose businesses to scale their impact. Madlen works with leaders to tailor their grant seeking and funding strategies, to write major tenders and grants, as well as offering bespoke consulting and mentoring services. You only need to have a quick read of the reviews on her website to see she comes highly recommended and has a wealth of experience. So welcome to the podcast, Madlen.
Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks so much for having me.
And before we dive in, I'd just like to acknowledge I'm joining you on Ngaitahu lands in Otautahi, Christchurch. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation.
Lovely. Yeah, and we pay our deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging. So to get us started, Madlen, do you want to give us a quick snapshot of your consulting business?
Yes, sure. I'd love to. Thank you. So I work as a strategic consultant in the for-purpose sector, and broadly I help organisations to align their governance, their funding and their operational systems so that their impact is sustainable and, where they seek it, scalable. I work with small and medium and also some larger not-for-profits and increasingly with social enterprises as well. A lot of the organisations that I work with are doing just extraordinary work in their community, and my work spans sort of family and domestic violence sector, working with arts organisations, working with organisations who are doing like direct humanitarian relief and support in the community, to name a few. And yeah, so they're doing extraordinary work, incredible impact. And where I come in often is where, maybe their systems haven't kept pace with their ambition, or maybe there's an area where they're needing to uplift some of their capability. It could be in strategic grant seeking, for example. It could be in somewhere in their operations. So bring in some systems to support operational rigor, operational planning, that sort of thing. Or it might just be a capacity thing. They might need someone that can come in and help them to get a few grants written or get some tenders written, develop some proposals. Often with that work, I will come in and want to be able to leave something behind more than the asset or the product that we've developed, the deliverable. Mm-hmm. So finding opportunities to work with the teams to build their skills as well. Yeah. Is that enough?
Yeah. No, that's really cool. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of listeners who will be interested in sort of your tips or tricks or your experience in, because I think it's quite valuable working across so many sectors as well, and being able to see sort of the commonalities and needs for systems change. So I guess that ties in nicely. What is something that clients typically sort of approach you for, or they think that they need versus what you think they actually need, or what does work often evolve as you're going?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, Alyssa. We've started our conversations before talking about grants, so I might start there. And often I get approached because an organisation is seeking a grant writer. So the entry point often is that they've identified an opportunity that they want to apply for and either don't have the capacity or the capability at that current point in the organisation, or both. So, the time or the skills, and will commence the engagement or even just at the discovery point, and I might realise that in the short term there's absolutely a need for just getting this grant drafted and written and over the line, but actually what they would benefit from is some support around developing their theory of change. For example, how are they articulating what it is that they're doing and the impact that they're having, their program logic. So being able to really step it out for funders, what it is that they're going to do and why, or even just supporting to build some of what I would call grant readiness assets, grant readiness systems, in terms of developing a clear bank of resources that they need. So whether that's just having the key organisational information in one place, having their program logic clearly articulated in a way that can be inserted into multiple grant applications, having a clear system for organising previous grant applications, grant calendar, like I'm talking sort of this basic sort of grant infrastructure stuff, being clear on when the deadlines are, when the opportunities are coming up, but also building in a bit more, I guess, like strategic thinking around the grant seeking process, supporting organisations to do things like identify what is the opportunity cost of any given grant. So if we're going to apply for this, what does that mean for the rest of our work? Doing a bit of a analysis there. Is it actually going to be worth our time? Thinking through what the implications are of winning this funding, making sure that they've got really good sort of costing systems in place so that we're not applying for a grant that's $30,000 where we actually need $1,000 to run the program and we don't know where the rest of the funding is going to be coming from. And I can develop these sort of as processes for the organization or a bit of a product where it's sort of either in a digital project management system, for example, if that's what the organization uses, or a simple Excel spreadsheet. Like there's lots of options and ways to be able to do this. And I guess as part of my work, it's meeting the organization where they're at as well. So some will be very keen to have it set up in something like ClickUp, or they might be using Jira, for example. Others are just really happy with a spreadsheet. So I think that's one of the clear examples for me of when organizations feel that they need a grant writer, but actually there's all of this strategic grant seeking and systems work that they would benefit from. Similarly to that, supporting with program design. So maybe they've got sort of a fuzzy idea or a previously delivered program, but need to either elevate it or adjust it for whatever reason, hopefully not just for funding opportunities, because that's something that we see quite a bit. Yeah, I think that's a pretty well-rounded example.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect example. I similarly face a lot in my business. Yeah, I think it is fairly common, that issue of sort of you go, oh, there's this grant immediately here. You're just constantly kind of almost crisis driven because you've got those deadlines looming, and it really is important, I think, sometimes to take that step back and do the strategy work around grants, because there's nothing worse than getting a $10,000 grant and realizing you don't have the systems in place to deliver on it, or you didn't actually, it's not actually what you wanted. So wasted all this time and effort. And then you sort of have to start again.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can actually cost the organization more in terms of effort to write the application. If we're talking about a $10,000 grant application, I mean, sometimes those applications oftentimes take just as much work as a $100,000 plus application. So we're looking at a cost there in terms of the resources. Then there's a cost in resources to deliver. And if the team is already stretched, there's going to be a cost and an impact to having them deliver something that they don't necessarily have the capacity to do. Not to say, I mean, I think that's a bit of not a cynical example, but it's sort of on one end of the spectrum, but just an example of where it can be problematic. And a lot of the conversations that I have with my clients, at some point in the conversation, I will say, like, you need to get more comfortable with saying no. Like, I know that there feels like there's a real urgency and there won't be another funding opportunity, and we need to just mold our programs and shift and kind of under cost things. But actually, I think that some of the magic is in being comfortable with saying, well, being comfortable with being uncomfortable in saying no. Like, it's not always comfortable, but being able to have some of those clearer boundaries around what funding we're going to apply for and what we're not going to, because we don't necessarily know where the next funding opportunity is coming from. And if you've got a bit more capacity and breathing room, actually there might be an opportunity that can shift the trajectory of a program coming
100%.
around the corner.
Yeah, you might have time, instead of investing in the 10K grant, to invest in the 100K one, and that might set you up better.
Exactly.
And I guess that's a nice lead in as well. From your experience, what are sort of the key things that separate out organizations that consistently win grants from those that struggle? And that could be, I guess, like sort of with or without your assistance as well, because we know it's not just about the grant writing process itself or the quality of the grant written itself.
Yes, that's a good question. And I think, just to extend on your thought or agree with your thought, I would say it's like less about the grant writing process than it is about some of the other factors. So being very clear on your theory of change, being very clear on your program logic. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that you need a consultant developed 10-page theory of change with a full, copy edited narrative. It just means having it articulated clearly and well so that whoever's reading it understands, what that theory of change is. Being clear internally on your program logic as well, so that when it does come to writing a grant, you can very clearly articulate, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? How are you going to do it? Who is going to do it? What are the outputs? What are the outcomes from that, and how are you going to measure those outcomes? And I think also having clarity around who's going to write the grant and in what time frame, because often
Yeah.
that it can often just fall to one person and it happens in a last minute dash. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but oftentimes it is avoidable. And also being really clear on who's delivering the program, what's the plan if we win the grant in quite a concrete way as well. Beyond that, Alyssa, I think it's the organisations that are keeping some track. It doesn't need to be a full digital dashboard, but just keeping some track of their hit rate and how many grants they're applying for, which ones they're winning, and those that always ask for feedback whether or not they win. If you're successful with the grant, that's kind of your feedback, but also if there's an opportunity to get a bit more information. But particularly if you're unsuccessful, taking up any opportunity for feedback is going to be very helpful. It might sometimes be generic and that can be frustrating. There might be a funder that just sends out some generic advice or just says that they don't have capacity to give feedback. I find that quite unfortunate, but increasingly I'm seeing funders giving feedback. And if it is generic, often sort of from government departments, it's detailed. I'm seeing feedback that's quite detailed, which is still helpful. So taking note of that. Yeah, I think that's, those are my tips there. Those are the differentiators.
Yeah, I really can't agree more with your point around the program logic and theory of change. I think even just sometimes having those things at an organizational level, if you're in a pinch, those are things that you can share. I know I've applied to Lottery West a few times and they really appreciate a good program logic, and just having them ready to go. They can be fairly quickly tailored to your program. If you know where your organization sits, what your overall impacts are, you can quickly scramble something together for a program around that. And then you've also got that cohesion from the organizational level to your program level. So yeah, that's a really good one. And also around the working with your existing systems, that's so valuable because I think, do you find organizations can sort of come to you and think they need sort of the next best system when sometimes if it's a small organization, an Excel spreadsheet might suffice?
Yes, and maybe the spreadsheet will suffice, but maybe it's not a leap to a full-blown CRM, for example. Like let's find something in between if they're wanting to move to something a little bit more sophisticated. Like there's quite a bit of low-cost software available, apps that can be used as well. But I would say absolutely an Excel spreadsheet can suffice. And also to that point in terms of impact measurement and impact tracking too. I mean, I think that having robust evaluation practices in place is great, but we can also overthink these things sometimes too. And for a small organization, keeping track of your numbers, keeping track of recipient, participant, community feedback is really important. Having a set of case studies, having a set of impact stories, and that can all be captured in a Google Doc, for example, or in a Word doc. And so I think it's less about the system that you're using or the platform that you're using and more about are we capturing these impact results consistently and are we doing it as a team? And so would often recommend, whether it's in a weekly team meeting or fortnightly or whatever cadence the team wants, having an agenda item that's just impact stories or impact data and getting those data points from the team as well and having it in one place so that it can be quickly drawn upon when the time comes to put the stories in front of a funder.
So true. That can really mean it's incredibly helpful for an external grant writer coming in, but
very helpful.
Yeah, that can also mean the difference between winning and losing. Yeah. So on that, I guess we've sort of got a sense of some of the tips for being more organized or strategic thinking. Yeah. Do you have any examples you could share of some of like the interesting client transformations you've seen, even if they're simple things? What did the client need, and then how did you support them?
Yeah, there's a few examples. The one that comes to mind, and it's because in the previous question, I wanted to talk a bit about alignment between the board, CEO and team, because I think that's another factor for the organizations that I see who are winning grants is having that alignment at all levels of the organization. And so I'm thinking about a client who were a small not-for-profit where there was sort of this scattergun approach to applying for grants. It came about in a number of ways, but I think that it for the most part, as it often does, is because there's good people wanting to do good work and wanting to fund as much of that good and impactful work as they can. But also there was some misalignment between what the expectation or I think it was more perceived expectation from the board around how much funding would be won on any given year. And so there was kind of this pressure. But I think that actually the target had been set inadvertently by the team as well. And so what we did is we had a strategic planning session, actually 2 strategic planning sessions, looking specifically at sort of what was the fundraising strategy, what were we trying to fund, first of all, getting really clear on what it was that we were trying to fund and why, and then how much we would need to fund that, and just bringing some more alignment between what the board was expecting, what those targets were, the timelines, and how that was going to be achieved for the team. And then from there, it was about having mechanisms in place for sort of regular tracking and reporting how they were tracking against the targets and reporting in to the board. And so having some metrics around how many grants had been applied for, what the hit was on them, some like a little bit of narrative around what the go, no go decisions were around the grants. But also what it did and what I'd noticed was that then there was more, I think by virtue of just being more involved in this process, there was just more buy-in around the grant seeking and more buy-in from the board, who then were able to leverage some of their skills, networks, resources to support the grant seeking and fundraising. And that particular organisation saw quite significant success in the years following that, and almost doubled their revenue, I think, in the 2 years following.
That's awesome. I'm sure it must have taken some of the pressure off too, because if the board has high expectations of the team and people feel like they're not performing, there's just a complete disconnect as well, isn't there, in what's actually achievable.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, it wasn't sort of high expectations. I mean, it was more perceived expectations. Like there just hadn't been that clarity around what is it actually that we expect here and how are we going to achieve that. And so, yeah, I think by being able to break down some of that communication friction or just supporting a bit more clarity there, everyone realizes that they're on the same team and that wanting to achieve the same things. So yeah, I think I don't want to sort of run the risk of saying that the board was being unfair, for example, in any way, but yeah, just I think just more clarity in that instance was very helpful.
Yeah, no, I really like that example. It's a good one, and something I think people would easily overlook, and then it can keep causing problems as well. So I guess in terms of looking more broadly at the grants and or fundraising landscape, are there any sort of key trends or changes that you've noticed, that things changing over the last few years for your clients? Or
I think generally we're seeing that it's feeling more competitive, and that often my clients are feeding back to me that it can feel, particularly the ones that have been are quite established and have been around for quite some time, that they're feeling that it is a more competitive landscape, that they're seeing less success with their grants. I think it's driven by a few things. I think that my perspective is that it is increasingly competitive, where there's new charities every year, but also it's what is the funder appetite to fund particular types of programs and work. We do see trends based on what's happening geopolitically, and we see trends on what's happening in Australia, what's happening, in terms of policy shifts and government priorities as well. So some sectors that might have been previously quite well funded and become accustomed to having that funding, or a particular type of funding, for example, like could be federal or state funding, then receiving less of that. And so then having to pivot potentially to trusts and foundations, philanthropic funding. We often hear around funders wanting to fund new programs and pilots. And so that becomes quite tricky for organisations who are delivering a much needed successful program year on year, but it's no longer new. It's actually got a proven track record. So I think for those organisations, it's about finding the right audience and finding the right match. There certainly are funders and grants out there for established programs. But I think on a positive note, we're also seeing trends like the pay what it takes movement in Australia, which have you got? Is that also, are you seeing that in New Zealand as well?
Not so much, but I'm sort of, my business is very Oz focused. So yeah, I have seen that report, and it is, really promising.
Super promising. It's that acknowledgement that in order to deliver impactful programs and continue to deliver impactful programs, we also need to fund what keeps the lights on and the overheads and beyond program delivery. And that extends to not just keeping the lights on, but it also extends to capability building within the organization, leadership development, recognizing that funding things like developing evaluation frameworks and all of that supports better outcomes for the community. And so that is very heartening. I'm really on board with the Pay What It Takes campaign, and I'm loving seeing the messaging around that and seeing how that's evolved over the last few years as well, and seeing more untied funding, and also seeing trends like more giving circles and more like crowd, I don't know if it's the right term, but crowdsourced philanthropic funding where people donate a relatively small amount each week, but actually it's the volume that then allows large grants to be distributed.
That's so true. Yeah. Also, I guess on your positive note, seeing more lived experience organizations popping up as well, yeah, is really nice. But I agree. I think when you have orgs that are represented by people with lived experience, I think that's where the Pay What It Takes stuff matters so much as well, is that because I think often there's that sustainability question in grants. You know, how are you going to sustain the funding beyond the funding period? And I think sometimes I just find it so unrealistic because I think, well, unfortunately, some things aren't going to be funded aren't going to keep going without some level of support. You know, there's certainly things that can become sustainable, but not everything. And I think that doesn't delegitimize the importance of a program.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think your point around lived experience is a really important one as well, because the sort of lived experience it's like it comes from such a place of passion and lived expertise, and probably some learned expertise as well. Like people are not just relying on their lived experience, but also I think funding those organizations is so important so that we don't risk as a community exploiting individuals who are so passionate about a cause and relying on them to do the work of something that should be publicly funded or funded more broadly. Yeah, I think we sort of have a social responsibility, a community responsibility to support those organizations, provided that they are doing impactful work.
That's a really good point. Yeah, not just filling a gap that should be covered elsewhere, stressing people out with something that should be addressed elsewhere.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I had a thought, Alyssa, as well, when you were saying, you know, that question around how is this program going to be sustainable beyond this grant? And it just reminded me of another tip. And I think that it's something that is often overlooked. And look, it's going to depend on the type of grant as well. Like if it's if it's an open funding, competitive funding round, you might not get this opportunity. But if it's a grant that has come about through a relationship with a philanthropic funder, for example, really drawing on that relationship and having the conversations around who else might you introduce us to? Who else do you think would be interested in supporting this work? And having those conversations, okay, this grant might not be able to sustain us, but could you give us some advice? Could you introduce us to some peers, and having that conversation about this is what we need to be able to sustain this program, being clear on your numbers, being clear on what you need to sustain the program, and then not being afraid to make those asks at the right moment as well.
I love that. Yeah, because I guess my head's often in the grant space, but it goes to show the importance of pairing it with that relationship. Partnership building with major donors can be such a valuable way to get funding as well, and the two can work really nicely together. Like you might get that pilot funding through the grant, yeah, and then you've got you've got the proof to go out to major donors who can continue that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess we often celebrate winning a grant. That's always wonderful for orgs. But what do you think organizations underestimate about what comes next? So like implementation pressure, compliance, acquittals, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that across the board, organizations underestimating the cost of what it takes to implement a grant. And I think that is driven by funders often only wanting to fund program costs. Sure, like I think that is a factor, but also I think it sort of comes from organizations just always trying to run it as lean as possible in order to win the grant, or at least like it's perceived that they need to do that in order to win the grant. So I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation happening here with why that happens. And so I think that then sort of potentially not considering the very practical implications of what happens then. Is the team then too stretched, or how actually are we going to fund the rest of the delivery of this program? I don't think that organizations are not aware of it. I think there's just not enough sort of honest decision-making conversations that happen upfront about that. And I guess that's been my theme a little bit in this conversation. And it's, certainly not trying to play the blame game. I think there's a lot of factors that kind of have led to that happening. I think also what I would like to see happening more is front loading some of the work around program or project management and also data collection and evaluation. So rather than being deep in delivery and then thinking about the evaluation at the end or the acquittal at the end, as I mentioned earlier, collecting those data points as you go along and setting up the infrastructure at the start to do that. I guess the nature of my work, I see a lot of these like challenges, and I work with, and maybe I'll speak to it a bit later, but I work with a lot of organizations who are from sort of marginalized communities. We just see the impacts of like the systemic issues, really like the very sort of practical impacts of that on the smaller organizations.
Oh, yeah. It's a big part of that world. It's hard not to. Unfortunately, it's kind of part and parcel of the not-for-profit space, isn't it? Just the challenges. But no, I think, I think you're doing a good job of being balanced and showing some of the good.
Great, thank you. So we were talking about what organizations sort of after like post winning the grant. So it can be tricky for organizations, and I fully acknowledge that when everyone is busy, we're doing a lot of delivery, there's a lot happening, often small teams, small but mighty teams doing a lot of work, it can feel difficult to carve out the space to front load some of that work. So developing your project management plan, making sure that you've assessed the risks, being clear on how you're going to mitigate them, setting up your systems to capture the data. But what we see is if that's not done at the start, there's often a scramble at the end. And that scramble at the end, unfortunately, will then impact the capacity to then seek out other funding opportunities. For example, there will be a cost somewhere to that. So I think that is probably the main piece for me that I see is sort of underestimated in terms of after we've won a grant. And then also for me, an important one is making sure, and again, going back to my point before around the alignment with the board and making sure that there's clear reporting into the board. There's like transparency around, where the funding is coming from, how we're utilizing it, and making sure that it's aligned to strategy, it's aligned to, hopefully there's a fundraising policy, it's aligned to that, and that it's taking the organization in the direction that they want to be going in.
Yeah, no, those are excellent points. And I'm sure, super useful for people listening, sort of going, oh, this is, we need to think, especially like your point around the front loading the project management, because it is so easy to overlook that. And then you get the funding and it is a scramble. And often you've set deadlines as well around when you're going to achieve things by, and you watch the milestones kind of tick on. But so, yeah.
Yeah. And I just one more point on that is that project management is a skill. It's a skill, it's a discipline in itself. And I think also just making sure that that capability is in the organization. And it probably is, because we're managing people that work in not-for-profits are wearing many hats often and just having to organically manage a lot of projects and a lot of different things. But I guess making sure that there is the capability within the organization to the extent that the organization needs at that given point in time. So if you've just won your first $100,000 grant or $500,000 grant or whatever it is, multi-year grant, have you got that capability to be able to manage that delivery, reporting, manage the budget along the way within the organization? If you don't, it's a good time, I would suggest, to invest in some of that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I guess while we're on sort of the systemic structural parts of grants and funding, kind of a bit of a miracle question. If you were given the space to fully redesign the system, the grants fundraising system, what key things would you change?
I love this question.
I appreciate it's a hard one.
And I also kind of hate it. Yeah. Like I love it and I hate it because it's a very big question. And, how would we do this? Look, I think for me, what I see is a lot of organizations wanting to collaborate and wanting to partner with others and recognizing that they can't do it all. And what's the saying? The impact is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So if we do it together, we can magnify the impact. So what I would love to see is more investment in infrastructure. I don't know what it looks like. I can't answer that question, but investing in that to support organizations to collaborate well and to be able to leverage pooled resources. Because I think that is where the magic happens when we can, yes, we need to fund overheads, but also being able to like reduce some of that across the board and shared resources, pooled resources. So something that would help that would help with supporting really genuine partnerships, sort of, which in that would include power sharing across organizations. That's where I'd like to see some investment. And as well as that, another thing that I would love to see more of is devolved funding for organizations. So particularly sort of community organizations, grassroots organizations. So seeing some of that funding flow through just directly to individuals that need it and supporting their autonomy and agency to be able to spend the way in the ways that they know will serve the community.
100%. Yeah. To your point on partnerships, it made me think if you've ever done consortium applications for grants, there's never the time to put in the work to properly design. Everyone's scrambling. You've got to get your pieces about your information in. You've got to find time. Like, I don't know how in a 6-week time frame, I think I've seen consortium applications where they're sort of coordinating information from 10 plus organizations. And it's just like, how on earth is 6 weeks enough time to achieve this? So I think on your infrastructure point, think also changing basic things like that, or like practicalities for partnership engagement at some point.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and we've seen it, right? Like, it's not pretty, but we've seen it that I'm applying for this grant in 10 days. Can I please get your letter of support? Or 3 days or 2 days. And this is how we're going to partner, and we'll work out the details later. And sometimes that just has to happen. And like I said, it's not pretty. We don't love it, but it does happen.
Yeah.
But I think for genuine partnerships, there needs to be really clear. There's that relational stuff, first of all. So there needs to be trust. There needs to be clear communication. Need to be, and I'll say it again, power sharing between the partnerships, be really clear on who's doing what, how decisions are made. And so I think like partnership governance is another thing that's like really important, really clearly articulating how decisions are going to be made, how risks are going to be managed, where the responsibility sits. And that stuff takes time, it takes time, takes work.
Yeah, 100%. I guess zooming out again, looking at, I guess, what led you to work in the not-for-profit space? What inspires you most about working in this space?
Yeah, the two different questions. So I'm going to decide which one to answer. That's okay. Because what led me here is quite a convoluted, not convoluted, but it's a very squiggly path. I was actually a chef in a previous life and a previous career, and so
that's cool.
So and then I worked in community mental health services and kind of found my way along the path to this space, and actually cut my teeth doing sort of large tenders for a national not-for-profit, which was a very steep learning curve.
Yeah, that would be.
Yes, it was. But in terms of what inspires me, is the people that I get to work with and the people that I get to meet, who are just, not to sort of be too reductionist, but they're just like really good eggs, like just really, really great people doing great work and such impactful work, and being able to contribute to that work in the way that I can. And I see the way that I can is drawing on my skills and traits around sort of pattern recognition, being able to recognize what the challenges might be for a given organization, and what are the opportunities to build their capability to solve some of those challenges. And it's often sort of translating quite a bit of complexity. Sometimes, not often. There's a balance, translating this complexity into some really clear and structured processes. I also really love, and increasingly so, I would say, I hadn't sort of recognized this about myself maybe a couple of years ago, but increasingly so love the storytelling part of it. So being able to really translate this sort of complex, nuanced, values-driven work into narratives that are clear and fundable. Really. Yeah, I think that's the thing. And also the last thing I'll say about that is that I see in a lot of organizations, and talking about founder-led lived experience, founder-led organizations, where there's such a heavy reliance on one individual or one or two individuals in the organization. But if the work needs to continue and they're doing really important, impactful work, then supporting that organization to put in place what they need to be able to steward the work of the organization moving forward and not just rely on one like pretty extraordinary individual. And so that's what drives me to do my work. And I think that's where I'm like bringing the value to my clients and supporting them.
Yeah, no, that's a really beautiful answer. I love the good eggs. I couldn't agree more. I don't think I've had a client where I've been like, oh, this person's intentions are misplaced, or it just doesn't exist in this sector. Well, I'm sure it does, but not that I've encountered.
Yeah,
luckily.
Not me. Yeah, I haven't encountered it. Yeah.
And so I guess a key kind of thing we want to cover in this podcast is around the role of technology in grants and the space more broadly. What role do you see technology, and I guess more specifically AI, playing in the future of your work as a consultant?
Yeah, I mean, the future of my work, my current work as well, I would say. I think I was a relatively, like maybe I'm overstating this, but I feel like I was a relatively early adopter of AI in my work. I certainly had a point of like being very super interested in it and like really focusing on, and experimenting lots and learning about it. Admittedly, that's sort of slowed down a little bit, but I think that I am seeing that most people are using it in some way. And so I think that it's not, and maybe I'm overstating that as well, but I'm seeing a lot of people using it. There is a lot of uptake, and I don't think it's going anywhere. And I think that my recommendation would be for organizations to get on board and at the very least learn about how it might potentially support the work of their organization. Because I think that what it brings, and particularly we've been talking about grant writing, I think particularly for grant writing, what it brings is an opportunity to be a bit more efficient, quite a bit more efficient in the way that you're writing grant applications, and potentially more effective, depending on the skills in the organization. There are caveats to that though. So I am a strong believer that individuals and organizations need to invest in building the skills and capability to use AI well, and to use it ethically. It's like AI is not the source of truth, I would say. Like actually, like it can make stuff up that people are probably not aware of as much as they should be. I think learning how to do quality prompting or utilize something. I've tested Grant Drafter, so learning how to use it properly, getting really clear on what are the inputs that you need to put into it in order to get high quality outputs is really where it's at. And I think that then it can be really beneficial for an organization. There's so many use cases for not-for-profits, charities, social enterprises. Like there's just so many use cases. Grant writing is just one of them. But yeah, I would say invest in learning about it.
Yeah, I really like that point around, I think there's so much fear mongering around the fact that AI is going to replace jobs. But to your point, and it may to a degree with sort of efficiency gains and things. But I think at the end of the day, as what you're saying, human judgment is still a key component in the usage.
So key. Yeah. Yeah, so key. And even with the grant writing, like you always want the human lens on it. So you wouldn't be, I would never, ever recommend that anyone draft a grant with AI and then just hit submit. You know, like you want to be reviewing it. You want to be making sure that what it's drafted for you is accurate. Yeah. And look, particularly with using AI, an organization was going to use AI going forward, then all of those sort of fundamentals that we spoke about earlier are even more important, being very clear on your impact, your impact data, your program logic, having all of that very clearly articulated, because that's what you want to be able to put in to Grant Drafter or another AI you're using to ensure accurate outputs.
And that's definitely why, from our perspective, building Grant Drafter, we wanted it to be a drafting tool, it's not your final version, because AI just isn't there yet. And, you should never really be in a situation where you're not reviewing your work before you submit something.
Absolutely.
But yeah, no, that's a good point. So overall, do you think it's a change for the better for the sector or the worse?
I think that's a very philosophical question.
It's nuanced.
It depends how deep do you want me to go on this? Because I think that, AI in general, is it better for us or is it worse? Is it for worse? Yeah, I'm not sure. But what I do know is that it is a tool that's not going away. It is a tool that, at least not for a while, and it can absolutely help to find efficiencies in your work. Increasingly, organizations will be using AI to draft grants. And grant makers are already seeing that across the board. I'm hearing that. And also what I'm hearing is that often it's the organizations that are where they've, whether or not AI drafted it, have had a human come over the top and make sure that they're not generic responses, that they're very tailored to the organization, have the right accurate information in them that are being differentiated from the mass AI responses that are happening. Yeah, so I think is it for the better? I think that it can be a very useful tool, and I would suggest that, beyond even grant drafting, it's not just about the writing of the grant as well. Like AI can also help with, for example, I probably don't want to get into too much detail around it, but there are ways that you could potentially identify gaps in your programming using AI. You could do quite a rapid synthesis of key documents that will support you with your grant writing using AI. So there's a lot of different use cases that you can and ways that you can use it even leading up to applying for grants that will then support funding applications as well.
It's true. Yeah, it's not just one limited use case at all, is it? And so I guess what gives you hope about the future of impact-driven work?
The thing that gives me hope is the people doing the impact-driven work. There is always people willing to step up and do this work, that believe in this work, that believe in a better world, myself included, because I think that we do this work because we believe in a better world, in a more just world, in a world where people can express and live their human rights. And that's what gives me hope, is that I am surrounded by people that continue to do this work, and despite the state of the world and the many injustices that we see around us, despite that, continue to persevere for a better world.
Yeah, I love that. No, that's so well said. And it's a nice lead in. So we'll close out the podcast with my quick fire round, just 3 questions.
Okay.
To take away from the bigger philosophical question. I'm just bringing you up and down all over the place. But yeah, so can you give me one word to describe management consulting in the for-purpose space?
Alignment.
Ooh, I like that. What's the most underrated skill in non-profit consulting?
Relational skills, people skills.
Nice. And then finally, do you have a not-for-profit hero, someone you look up to in the space? That could be an organization or an individual as well.
So many. Like there are just so many people doing incredible work across sort of all of the different of this space, like the people working in charities, people doing the funding, intermediaries. So I'm giving you a long answer to a rapid fire question, intermediaries like, okay. Like myself. But I think that the people that inspire me, it's not one person, it's the people that are working sort of in grassroots organizations, leading movements, and particularly those who are from more marginalized groups who typically don't see the funding flow through to them as often, and yet they persevere. And they're just doing this incredible work in their communities. And often, the quiet work, the untold work, those are the people that really inspire me.
Yeah, so it's hard to name just one, isn't it?
I couldn't. I know it's just too many incredible people. I couldn't name just one, but yeah.
No, that's perfect. Well, that's a nice way to close us out. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been really awesome speaking with you and
Thank you.
Yeah, getting your wisdom. And yeah, so just a quick note that the podcast is powered by a grant drafter, helping organizations to draft their next grant in 5 minutes or less. If you haven't already, check out the Grant Drafter website at grantdrafter.com. And for those listening, we hope you're feeling inspired to get out there and maximize your impact.